Hello everyone. Welcome back to Horrifying Stories. I know a lot of you like to listen to these videos before falling asleep, and I'm here to help. Before you drift off, please leave a comment and let me know where you're listening from. If you're enjoying this video, don't forget to like and subscribe. Story 1. The snow fell thick and fast, blanketing the small town in a thick, cold silence. It was Christmas Eve, and the streets were empty, too cold for anyone to be outside, too late for children to be playing. The wind howled down the narrow alleyways, swirling around the old brick buildings. The streetlights cast eerie shadows on the snow, flickering occasionally as if struggling against the storm. In the heart of the town stood a small, forgotten house. Its roof was weighed down with snow, and its windows were dark, covered by thick curtains that had not been opened in years. The house looked abandoned, yet it wasn't. Inside, a fire crackled in the hearth, but no one was there to enjoy its warmth. The house belonged to the Hollis family. At least it used to. Now only one person lived there, Thomas Hollis, the youngest of the family. He had been alone since his parents disappeared on Christmas Eve 5 years ago. Everyone had assumed they had just run away, but there was no evidence, no trace of them. Just an empty house and a broken boy. Every Christmas, Thomas would sit in the living room, staring at the tree his parents had left behind. The tree was still decorated, the ornaments faded with time, the lights dimming with age. But Thomas couldn't bring himself to take it down. It was the only thing that reminded him of his family, the only piece of warmth left in a house that had turned cold and lifeless. Tonight was no different. The snowstorm outside raged against the windows, but Thomas barely noticed. He had grown used to it over the years, the isolation, the quiet. He had even convinced himself that he liked it. He didn't need anyone. Not anymore. But tonight, something was different. The wind howled louder than usual, rattling the old wooden frames. The fire flickered, casting long, dancing shadows across the room. And then a sound. Soft at first, almost imperceptible. A whisper, like someone was calling his name. "Thomas!" He froze, his heart skipping a beat. He turned toward the window, but the snow outside was thick, blanketing everything in a sea of white. He could see nothing but the swirling storm. "Thomas." This time, the voice was louder, more distinct. It seemed to come from the direction of the kitchen. With a trembling hand, Thomas stood up from the couch. The house seemed to creak and groan as if it were alive, whispering things that were never meant to be heard. His pulse raced as he slowly walked toward the kitchen, his steps heavy against the old wooden floor. The kitchen was empty. The only sound was the wind, howling through the cracks in the house. "Hello?" Thomas called, his voice wavering. No answer. But then he saw it. A figure stood at the edge of the room, just barely visible in the dim light. A figure wearing an old coat, its face obscured by shadows. Thomas's breath caught in his throat. His first thought was that it was his mother, his father, someone who had returned after all these years. But then he remembered the truth. They were gone. They were never coming back. Who are you?" Thomas whispered, his voice trembling. The figure didn't answer. It simply stepped forward, its movement jerky and unnatural, like a puppet being controlled by invisible strings. Thomas's heart pounded in his chest as the figure came closer, its face still hidden in the shadows. The air in the room grew colder, the fire in the hearth flickering wildly. And then, the figure spoke. "Thomas," it said, the voice a low, raspy whisper that seemed to echo inside his head. "We've come for you." Thomas's stomach dropped. His breath caught in his throat as a cold sweat formed on his brow. The voice, so familiar, yet so distant, sent chills down his spine. It was as if something from his past, something he had buried deep within himself, was clawing its way back into his life. "We've come for you." The figure took another slow step forward, and Thomas could now see more clearly that it was a woman, her face hidden under a thick hood. She was tall, too tall, her silhouette stretched unnaturally against the dim light of the room. But it wasn't just her height that unsettled him. There was something wrong with the way she moved, her motions jerky, like she was struggling to control her own body. The kitchen seemed to darken even more, the shadows growing deeper, swallowing up the light. And then Thomas heard it, the soft sound of footsteps, as though more people were entering the room behind him. He spun around, but the kitchen was still empty. The figure in front of him spoke again, her voice growing colder. "You've been waiting for this moment, Thomas," she whispered. "Haven't you?" Thomas's pulse raced, his mind spiraling with confusion. He didn't know what to think, what to believe. The woman's presence felt familiar, yet impossible. The way her words echoed in his mind, the way they made his heart ache, made his knees buckle with the weight of memories long forgotten. No, you're not real," Thomas muttered, trying to convince himself. "This isn't real. You're just a dream, a nightmare." The figure tilted her head, a slow, deliberate movement, and for a moment, Thomas could see her eyes, glowing faintly in the darkness, like two burning embers. "No, Thomas," she said softly. "We are very real, and we've been waiting for you." With a sudden lurch, the figure stepped forward, her hand reaching out toward him. The air around them seemed to freeze, the temperature dropping so rapidly that Thomas could see his breath fogging in the air. He tried to step back, but his legs felt heavy, as though they were rooted to the floor. "Why?" he choked out, his voice shaking. "Why now? Why on Christmas Eve?" The figure didn't answer right away. Instead, she stepped closer, the other shadowy figures behind her growing clearer. Thomas could now make out their shapes, pale, gaunt, their faces frozen in expressions of horror, like they had been caught in a moment of terror for eternity. The figures moved in unison, their eyes locked on him. "We've come for you, Thomas," the woman repeated, her voice colder, more commanding. "For what you took from us." Thomas felt a chill run down his spine as the words hit him like a slap. Something clicked in his mind, a long-buried memory suddenly resurfacing, raw and jagged. He remembered the Christmas Eve when his parents had disappeared, the strange figures he had seen outside the window, the soft murmurs that echoed in the house. He had been a child, only 8 years old at the time, and the details had faded over the years. But now, in this moment, it all came rushing back. His parents had been involved in something dark, something that he didn't understand. And whatever it was, it had come back for him now. "I didn't," Thomas stammered, his mind struggling to piece everything together. "I didn't take anything. I don't understand." The woman reached forward, her fingers icy cold against his skin as she touched his cheek. "You don't remember, do you?" she asked, her voice soft but chilling. "You don't remember what your parents did to us, Thomas? But we remember. We remember everything." The figures around her began to move closer, closing the distance, their hands reaching toward him. Thomas's heart pounded in his chest, panic flooding his mind. He backed away, stumbling into the table, knocking over an old family photo. The glass frame shattered, scattering across the floor. But Thomas couldn't focus on the broken glass. He could only focus on the cold hands that were closing in on him. "No, please," Thomas pleaded, his voice desperate. "I don't remember. I didn't do anything. Please, just let me go." But the woman's expression remained unchanged. She took another step closer, her presence suffocating. The room grew colder still, the air thick with the weight of centuries of grief and rage. "You took something precious from us," the woman whispered, her voice barely audible above the howling wind. "And now, we've come to take it back." Suddenly, Thomas felt an overwhelming pressure in his chest. It was as though the air itself had become too thick to breathe, and every inhale was a struggle. His vision blurred, his hands shaking uncontrollably. The figures surrounding him began to blur together, their faces morphing into something monstrous, something twisted. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. The woman's face was inches from his now, her cold breath washing over him as she whispered in his ear, "This is what happens when you forget." The last thing Thomas remembered before everything went black was the haunting sound of the figure's footsteps, slowly marching away from him, leaving him in the cold, dark room, alone, trapped in the depths of his own forgotten nightmares. Thomas's breath came in ragged gasps as the darkness around him thickened. The cold that had once been so unbearable had now become a suffocating presence, pressing in on him from all sides. He couldn't move, couldn't speak. His body felt like it was made of stone, rooted to the floor, unable to escape. The last thing he had heard before the cold overtook him was the faint echo of those hollow footsteps, slowly fading away into nothing. He tried to blink, to clear his mind, but his eyes were sluggish, heavy. It was as if he was trapped in a fog, his thoughts swirling and elusive, drifting farther away the more he tried to grab onto them. And yet, amidst the haze, one thought lingered. He remembered his parents. The memories, blurry at first, began to return like fragments of a broken puzzle. Their faces, their voices, the warmth of Christmas mornings, all seemed to slip through his fingers like sand. But one thing, one chilling detail, stood out from all the others. He remembered the strange men that had come to their house that night. Tall, shadowed figures, their faces covered, their eyes cold and unfeeling. They had been there just before his parents disappeared, speaking in hushed tones, making deals that Thomas could not understand. And now, those same figures, those same cold, vengeful spirits, were here for him. Thomas's body finally began to respond, his limbs twitching as the fog around him began to lift. His mind felt heavy, like it had been clouded by the years of silence and grief that had followed his parents' disappearance. He forced himself to move, to stand, to shake off the terror that had a hold on him. The house was eerily still, its walls creaking in the silence. But it was a different kind of stillness, an oppressive, unnatural quiet that made his skin crawl. The fire in the hearth was just a pile of embers now, the flickering warmth long gone. The Christmas tree stood in the corner, its lights dim, but it wasn't the same tree he had remembered. It looked wrong, like a decaying reminder of something lost. Something was watching him. He could feel it. And then, just as he turned toward the kitchen, he heard it. The sound of faint footsteps, slow and deliberate, growing closer. His heart lurched in his chest. He spun around, but there was no one there. The door to the living room creaked open, revealing nothing but shadow. Thomas's breath caught in his throat. There, standing just at the edge of the threshold, was a figure. Tall, cloaked in black. It was the woman, but her face was now fully visible, and what he saw made his blood run cold. Her face was pale, too pale, like porcelain. Her eyes glowed faintly, but there was no warmth in them, only cold, unfeeling emptiness. Her lips were cracked, the skin almost frozen, and her long black hair hung loosely around her face, wet with some substance Thomas couldn't identify. She stepped forward, her feet making no sound against the floor, and Thomas froze. Her presence seemed to distort the air itself, making it thick and heavy, like the weight of the world was pressing down on him. "You remember now, don't you, Thomas?" Her voice was low, smooth, but filled with an unsettling echo, as if there were many voices speaking in unison. The price of forgetting. Thomas took a shaky step backward, his mind racing. He wanted to scream, to run, to do anything to escape. But he couldn't. His feet were glued to the floor, his body paralyzed with fear. His mind screamed, but his throat was tight, unable to produce a sound. What do you want from me?" Thomas managed to croak, his voice hoarse with fear. The woman tilted her head, her eyes narrowing as she studied him. There was a long, uncomfortable silence, and Thomas could hear his heart pounding in his ears. "You know," she whispered, "you know exactly what we want." Suddenly, the house seemed to come alive with movement. The shadows deepened, swirling around the edges of the room like a living thing. The temperature dropped even further until Thomas could see his breath in the air. He shivered, but not from the cold. Something much deeper was causing the fear to well up inside him. The woman took another step closer, her icy hand reaching out toward him. Thomas instinctively took a step back, but she was faster. Her fingers brushed against his cheek, sending an electric shock of terror through his body. "I've waited for this day, Thomas," she whispered, her voice now cold and sharp, like the biting wind outside. "For so long, I've waited." Thomas's legs gave way, and he collapsed to his knees, his hands trembling as they gripped the floor. The room spun around him, the shadows closing in, suffocating him with their weight. The woman's face loomed above him, and her lips parted in a smile that was anything but comforting. "You can't run from your past, Thomas," she hissed. "It always catches up to you." And just as he felt himself slipping into darkness, the air around him thickened. The shadows seemed to close in even tighter, until they became tangible, wrapping themselves around him like chains. He gasped, struggling to breathe, to move. The woman's cold laugh echoed in his ears as the last vestiges of light disappeared from the room. The cold that wrapped around him tightened, suffocating him, pressing on his chest as if the very air had turned into ice. His lungs burned as he gasped, trying to inhale, but all he could feel was the crushing weight of the shadows surrounding him. The woman's voice, a low and eerie whisper, echoed through the thick darkness, her words seeping into his mind like poison. "You can't escape what's coming," she taunted, her voice seeping through his skin, settling in the pit of his stomach. Her presence was everywhere, as if she was in the very air he breathed, wrapping herself around his thoughts. He couldn't escape her, couldn't push her away, no matter how hard he tried. Thomas's heart pounded in his chest, each beat a violent reminder that he was still alive. Alive in a nightmare that he couldn't wake from. His hands, shaking uncontrollably, reached up to touch his face, his cheek where her fingers had made contact. The cold lingered, like a frost that had burned into his skin. His head spun, and his vision blurred. With every passing moment, the shadows seemed to stretch longer, the room distorting, shifting, bending around him. The walls closed in, and Thomas's stomach churned as the realization hit him. This was no longer the house he had known. It was a place twisted, a place where time and space no longer followed any rules he could understand. The room was no longer just cold. It was dark, freezing to the point where he could feel it in his bones, his very soul. "No," Thomas whispered, his voice a broken tremor in the silence. He tried to stand, but his legs were unresponsive, like they had turned to stone. The woman's figure loomed closer, her eyes still glowing faintly, her lips curling into a cruel smile. She knelt before him, her cold breath brushing against his face, and for the first time, Thomas saw something that made his heart freeze. Behind her, through the pitch-black shadows, shapes began to emerge. Figures, indistinct at first, began to form. Tall, ghostly figures draped in tattered cloaks, their faces obscured by the darkness. They moved silently, circling around him like vultures, their presence suffocating, their coldness seeping into the very air. "You thought you could forget," the woman hissed, her voice almost a song of mockery, "but you never could. We were always here, waiting for you to remember." Thomas could feel the icy tendrils of terror creeping into his heart, his mind fighting to hold on to any shred of sanity. The memories that had been buried for so long were coming back now, flooding him with images he could barely comprehend. His parents, their faces twisted in fear, their last desperate cries, the dark figures that had come to his house so many years ago. He had tried to block them out, but they were impossible to erase. "The price was paid that night," the woman whispered, as though reciting a twisted lullaby. "And now you belong to us." The shadows seemed to grow stronger, more oppressive, as they closed in on him. He could feel their icy hands touching his skin, brushing against his arms, his legs, their cold fingers sinking into his flesh. His body trembled, but he couldn't move. He couldn't escape. "You belong to us, Thomas," the woman repeated, her voice laced with satisfaction. "Just as your parents did." Suddenly, the air seemed to crackle with a strange energy. The room shifted again, and the figures, those dark, twisted shapes, began to draw closer. Each of them had the same hollow, emotionless gaze. Their eyes glowed, not with life, but with an insatiable hunger, an emptiness that seemed to consume everything in its path. Thomas could hear them now, their whispers merging into a low hum, their voices indistinguishable from one another, but all speaking the same chilling words. "He will remember," they chanted. "He will remember the price." His vision blurred, the world spinning as he began to lose himself in the swirling darkness. He closed his eyes tightly, trying to block out the overwhelming fear, the suffocating cold, the terrifying whispers that filled his ears. But it was useless. The memories, the terrible memories, kept flooding his mind. It was his fault. The darkness had come because of him. He had forgotten. He had forgotten the deal made that night, the terrible pact his parents had made with these spirits, these creatures that now surrounded him. His parents had tried to shield him from the truth, tried to protect him from the horrifying reality of their choices. But the price had been paid, and now the ghosts had come to collect what was owed. A cold, cruel laughter echoed around him, making his skin crawl. The woman's face twisted into something grotesque, her once beautiful features now a mask of anger and hunger. "You cannot run from the past, Thomas," she sneered. "It always finds you, and now you will pay the price." His body was trembling, his mind numb with terror. He had no way of knowing what was real anymore, no way of escaping this nightmare that had trapped him. The shadows reached out, pulling him closer, their icy grip tightening around his chest. The cold seeped deeper into his skin, into his very soul. And then, just as he thought he would be consumed by the darkness, There was a flash of light, a burst of warmth that cut through the cold like a blade. It was fleeting, but for a moment, he felt something break through the suffocating gloom. "No!" Thomas screamed, his voice breaking through the oppressive silence. "I won't forget. I won't let you win." The shadows seemed to recoil at his words, their grasp faltering for just a moment. The figures hesitated, as though unsure of what to do. And in that brief instant of hesitation, Thomas found the strength to stand, to push through the darkness that threatened to pull him under. With every ounce of willpower he had left, he reached for the warmth of the light, the last shred of hope
deep
that
in the
remained.
heart of the Arctic wilderness
The
was a
figures,
cabin long
the
abandoned.
cold,
Its once
the
warm
woman,
hearth now cold and forgotten.
all of it seemed to shift,
Locals referred to it
to waver
as
as
the
though
frostbitten
reality
cabin.
itself was breaking
Its reputation
apart.
was a dark one.
He didn't know
Every
how,
explorer,
but he knew
every
one
adventurer,
thing for sure.
every soul
He
who
would
had ever
not
spent
let
a
them
night
have
within
him.
its walls
He would
had
fight,
disappeared,
even if
leaving
it
nothing
meant
behind
facing the
but
horrors of his
strange tracks
past.
in the snow leading deeper into the frozen
Story 2.
expanse. For Sarah and her friends,
The wind
the
howled
stories of the
outside,
frostbitten cabin
the snow
were just
still swirling
tales,
in the air,
old
but
legends
inside,
spun
the
to
house
keep
remained
curious
eerily
travelers away
silent.
from the harsh tundra.
Alex stood frozen,
They had come to the Arctic
staring at the
seeking
strange
adventure,
keys in his
a
hand,
break from the
their
monotony of
foreign
city
weight
life.
like a heavy burden.
Sarah, the group
The cold
leader,
that had once been
was the
outside
kind
now
who sought
seemed to
thrill
creep
and
inside
mystery.
his skin,
The
spreading through his
cabin was their
bones,
destination,
sending chills
its
that made him
eerie
shiver
history only
uncontrollably.
adding to the allure.
The feeling that something was
just an old
terribly
cabin,
wrong was growing
Sarah had
stronger
said
with
as
every
they planned
passing
their trip.
second. But
We'll
it wasn't
spend one
just the
night there,
keys.
prove the stories
whole
are nonsense,
situation
and
felt
come back
off.
with a great story to tell.
How had they ended up in his
Her
car?
friends, Max,
Who else could have
Elena,
been there?
and Dylan, had
He
reluctantly
was alone
agreed.
when he had parked in his driveway.
But as they trekked through
There was
the
no
endless
logical
white expanse,
explanation.
the chill
A
seeping into
faint
their
sound
bones,
broke the silence,
they began to question
his
their
phone
decision.
vibrating on the kitchen counter.
The cabin appeared
Alex
just as
jumped
the
at the
sun
noise,
dipped below the
his
horizon,
heart racing.
casting the
He
world in
hurried to
shades of
grab it,
gray and
hoping
blue.
it might bring some comfort
It sat
or
alone
clarity.
on a small
But
rise,
the name on the screen
its
made his
silhouette
stomach
stark
twist.
against the icy
It was his
landscape.
sister, Emma.
It looks
She had called
normal,
earlier that day to wish him a
Max
Merry
said,
Christmas,
his voice
and they
muffled
joked
by the
about
scarf
plans
around
for
his
New
face.
Year's. But now,
But Elena
seeing
shook
her
her
name
head.
on the screen filled him
Normal?
with dread.
It looks
His
like it's
finger
waiting
hovered
for
over
us.
the screen, hesitating,
Sarah ignored her,
his
pushing
heart
forward.
pounding against his
The
ribcage.
snow crunched beneath
With
their
a deep
boots as
breath,
they approached.
Alex answered the
The
call.
cabin's windows were dark,
Alex,
and the door hung slightly ajar,
Emma's voice came
creaking
through,
softly
trembling,
in the wind.
and he could hear the panic in her tone.
Inside, it was
Alex,
colder than they
you
expected.
need to come back to the house now.
The walls were covered
Please.
in frost.
I don't know who else
and
to
the
call.
air was heavy with a strange
The
metallic
panic in her
scent.
voice made his chest tighten.
It's just a cabin,
What happened?
Sarah said again,
Emma,
though her voice
what's
lacked
going
its
on?
usual confidence.
I don't
Dylan
know.
set down his pack
There's something
and
wrong
began
with the
unpacking
house.
their supplies.
Something's
Let's get a
here.
fire going.
Her
This
voice
place
broke,
is freezing.
and Alex could hear her breathing heavily in the
The fire
background.
crackled in the hearth,
I keep hearing
casting
things
flickering light across
in the
room.
walls, in the
They
attic.
huddled close,
It's
eating
not just the
canned
wind.
food and sharing nervous
It's
laughter.
like
It's just one
something's
night.
moving.
Sarah reminded them.
I don't feel safe
Tomorrow,
here anymore.
we'll head back.
Alex's
But as the
stomach
hours
dropped.
passed, the unease
Emma,
in the
are you
cabin
sure?
grew.
You're scaring me.
Shadows seemed to shift in the corners.
I know,
and the
but
wind
I'm not
outside
alone.
howled like a living
I swear
thing.
there's someone
It was
or
Dylan
something
who first
watching
noticed
me.
the footprints.
Her voice was barely above a
Hey
whisper
guys,
now.
come look at this.
I'm locked in my room. I can't.
They gathered near the door,
The call
where the
cut
snow
off,
had blown in.
leaving Alex
The
with
prints were
nothing
small,
but the eerie
like those of a
silence of the
child,
house
but they
and the
were
distant
wrong.
wind howling
The
outside.
toes were too long,
His
too
hand
thin,
clenched around the phone,
almost claw-like.
his mind racing.
They weren't there
Something
when we
was
came
definitely
in,
wrong.
Max said,
He
his
couldn't
voice
just sit
trembling.
here and do nothing.
Someone's playing
Without
a prank,
thinking,
Sarah
Alex
said,
grabbed his coat,
though she didn't
his
sound
shoes,
convinced.
and rushed out the
The
door.
night deepened,
The
and the
wind
temperature
slammed against
dropped
him as he
even
made his
further.
way to his car. The snow
Despite the
falling
fire,
harder now,
the cold
the
seemed to
world
seep
around
into
him
their
turning
bones.
into a thick blur of white.
Elena was the first to hear the
His
scratching.
breath came in frantic gasps,
started softly,
but he couldn't slow down.
like a branch brushing against
His
the
sister
window,
was in danger,
but grew louder,
and he needed to get
more
to her.
insistent.
As he
There's
drove,
something outside,
the thought of what she had
whispered,
said, the
clutching her
movement
blanket.
in the walls, the
Sarah
strange
grabbed a
feeling of
flashlight
being
and peered
watched,
out the frosted
sent
window.
chills up his
The
spine.
beam of light cut through the
He
darkness,
tried to
revealing
rationalize
nothing
it.
but swirling snow.
Maybe it was just the isolation of the house.
just the wind,
Maybe it was just
she
her
said,
imagination
though her
running
hands
wild.
shook as she set the
But
flashlight
deep down, he couldn't
But the
ignore the
scratching
nagging
continued,
feeling that there
moving
was
from the
something
window
more
to the
sinister at
walls,
play.
then to the door.
The drive felt like an
Someone's
eternity.
out there,
The
Max
roads
said, his
were
eyes
slick
wide.
with ice, and the
No,
wind only made it
Elena
harder
whispered.
to see.
Something's out there.
But eventually,
The
the
fire
familiar
dimmed.
outline of his
its light
childhood
flickering
home
weakly.
appeared in the distance,
Sarah fed it
barely
more
visible
wood,
through the
but
storm.
the flames seemed reluctant to grow.
His heart skipped a
And then
beat,
they heard the voice,
but before he could
a
even get
child's
out of the
voice,
car,
soft and
he
melodic.
noticed something that stopped
drifting
him
through
dead
the
in his
cold.
tracks.
Help me!
The house looked different.
Please!
It was as if it
came
had
from
changed in
outside,
some
barely
subtle,
audible over the
unnatural
wind.
way. The
We
windows,
can't just leave them
once
out
warmly
there,
lit,
Dylan said,
were now
moving
dark.
toward the door.
The front door
No!
was wide open,
Sarah grabbed his
swaying
arm.
slightly with
You don't
the
know
wind.
what's out there.
Alex's
But
throat
what if it's
tightened,
real?
his eyes
Dylan
scanning the
pulled free
house,
and opened the
looking
door.
for any sign
The
of
wind
Emma.
rushed in,
but there was
extinguishing
nothing.
the fire and
Just
plunging the room
emptiness.
into darkness. Wait!
Emma, he called
Sarah
out,
called,
his voice
but
breaking the
Dylan had
stillness
already
of the
stepped
night.
outside.
The only answer was
They
the
huddled
wind.
in the dark, waiting for Dylan to return.
Alex's footsteps crunched in the
Minutes
snow as he
stretched
moved
into an
toward the door,
eternity,
the
and then
eerie
they heard his
silence almost
scream.
suffocating.
It was
He
high-pitched,
stepped cautiously
filled with
inside,
terror,
every nerve
and it
on
ended
edge.
abruptly.
The air felt colder than
Elena
before,
sobbed, her breath
biting
visible
into
in the
his skin
freezing
as he
air.
made his way through the house.
We have to leave.
It was
we have to leave
unnervingly
now.
quiet. Too quiet.
Max nodded, grabbing his pack.
Emma,
But Sarah
he
hesitated.
called again, his
We can't
voice
just
shaky.
leave him out there. He's
Still
gone!
no answer.
Elena shouted,
The
tears
house
streaming
felt
down her face.
Wrong.
Don't you get it?
The walls seemed
Whatever's
to close
out
in
there
on
took him.
the floor creaking under his weight
They
as he
ran.
moved through the dimly
The
lit
snowstorm
hallway.
had worsened, the
He
wind
called her
howling like a
name once
banshee,
more,
but they pushed
his
forward,
heart thudding in his
leaving the
chest.
cabin behind.
And then from
The footprints
upstairs,
followed them,
he heard it.
those small, claw-like prints that
faint
seemed
whisper.
to multiply the further they
His
went.
blood ran
Max
cold.
stumbled and
He
fell,
froze in place,
his
straining
scream
to
cutting
hear.
through the night
It
as
was
something dragged
unmistakable.
him into the snow.
The whisper wasn't just a
Max!
sound. It
Sarah
felt like
reached
a
for him,
voice,
but
familiar
Elena
and
pulled
distant.
her back.
But it wasn't
Run!
Emma's.
By the time they reached
Slowly,
the edge of the
Alex
forest,
made his way
only
toward the
Sarah
stairs,
and Elena remained.
his mind racing with
They
every
collapsed
possible
against a
explanation.
tree, gasping for breath.
But nothing seemed to make
The
sense.
storm had passed.
His
and
hand
the world
gripped
was
the railing
eerily
as he
quiet,
ascended, the
but the
whisper
footprints
growing
were
louder
still
with
there,
every step.
circling them.
Emma,
Do you
he
hear
called,
that?
but his
Elena
voice
whispered,
trembled in his throat.
her eyes wide with terror.
As he reached the top of the
Sarah
stairs,
listened.
the air
In
grew
the
heavier,
distance, carried on
colder.
the wind, was
The
the sound
hallway
of a
stretched
child's
out before
laughter.
him, the doors
never
to the
made it
rooms
back
on
to the
either
village.
side standing like
The
sentinels.
search party found the cabin
At the
empty,
end of the hall
its
was
door
Emma's
swinging
room,
open
the
in
door
the wind.
slightly ajar.
In the snow outside
But as
were
he
hundreds of
approached,
small,
something caught his
claw-like
eye.
prints, leading
shadow.
into the wilderness.
It moved.
And on cold,
No,
silent
It
nights,
shifted.
travelers
Something
swear
was
they
in
can
her
hear
room.
a child's voice,
His heart
calling
pounded
from
as
the
he pushed the
frostbitten
door
cabin.
open, his breath coming faster
Days
now.
turned into weeks, and
The
the
room was
rumors of the
dark,
frostbitten
and the
cabin
first thing he
only
noticed
grew
was the
stronger.
strange,
The
oppressive
search party,
stillness that
after
filled the
finding no
space.
trace of Sarah, Elena,
Emma's
or their
bed was
friends,
empty.
whispered of strange
Emma,
occurrences.
He whispered,
Footprints appearing
stepping
overnight,
forward.
whispers in the wind,
He could hear his
and a
voice
haunting
echo
laughter
in the
that echoed
silence,
through the frozen
and his hands
wilderness.
trembled as he turned on
The
the
cabin
light.
remained untouched,
But when the room lit
its
up,
dark windows
his stomach
staring
dropped.
blankly at the tundra like
The
hollow
walls,
eyes.
where Emma
But
had once hung
curiosity
her
never
childhood
stayed dormant
drawings,
for long.
were now covered in something
Months
dark,
later, a
something
new
wet.
group of adventurers arrived
was a
in the
stain.
Arctic. Their
No,
sights
not just
set
a
on
stain.
unraveling the
The
mysteries
walls
of the
were
frostbitten cabin.
bleeding.
Among them was
He
Matthew,
backed away, his
a
mind
writer
racing.
seeking inspiration,
What was
and
happening
Clara,
here?
a skeptic
What
who
was all of
scoffed at
this?
ghost stories.
A sudden crash
With them
behind
were
him
two
made him
seasoned
spin around,
guides,
his
Ivan
heart in
and
his
Greta,
throat.
locals
Emma's
familiar
closet
with the
door
area,
was now wide
but
open, and
wary of the
something
cabin's reputation.
or someone was standing
People
inside.
vanish because they are
But
unprepared
all he
for
could
the
see
Arctic,
was a figure,
Greta said as they
tall,
approached
thin,
the
with
cabin.
long, stringy hair.
Not because of
It
ghosts,
was a woman.
but Ivan
her
shook his
face-
head. It's
Her
not
face
just
was
the cold.
twisted,
This place,
her skin pale and
it's wrong.
stretched too thin,
you'll see.
like she had been long dead.
The cabin looked just as it had in the
Alex
stories,
gasped, stepping
isolated,
back, his chest
weathered,
tightening with
and
panic.
unwelcoming.
The figure moved
As
slowly,
they stepped
but
inside,
then,
a wave of icy
Alex,
air greeted them,
please,
far colder
help
than
me.
the tundra outside.
Emma's voice
The
came from
metallic scent
behind
hung
him.
heavy in the air.
He turned
and the
around,
walls seemed to
his
shimmer
mind
with
in a
frost,
whirl,
despite
Emma
the
wasn't
absence
there.
of wind.
She was
This is it? Clara
somewhere
asked,
else,
setting her pack down.
somewhere
Looks
in the
like
house.
any other abandoned shack.
And now the woman in the
Matthew
closet
didn't
was moving
respond.
towards him.
His eyes were fixed
Alex's
on the
heart
faint
raced in
footprints
his
that led
chest
from the
as the
door to the
figure in
center
the
of the
closet
room,
moved
where they
closer,
abruptly
its
ended.
movement slow and
Greta
deliberate,
shivered.
like a predator
We shouldn't
toying
stay
with
here
its
long.
prey. The
As night
woman's
fell,
face,
the group
so
huddled
pale
around
and
a portable
stretched,
heater, their
seemed to flicker
flashlights
in the
casting
dim
long
light.
shadows across the
Her
walls.
hollow eyes locked
Clara
on him.
laughed as Greta
He could
recounted
almost
the
feel
legends
the
of the
cold
frostbitten
emanating from
cabin.
her. A cold that
They say
wasn't
the
just
cabin
from the
calls
winter
to
night
people,
outside,
Greta
but from
said,
something
her voice
darker,
low.
something
that it
unnatural.
lures them in with whispers
He
and
spun
traps them
around,
here.
his mind
And those
spinning.
footprints,
Emma,
they don't belong
he
to a
called out
child.
again, his
They belong
voice
to
trembling.
something older.
The sound
something
of her voice
ancient.
was still echoing in his ears,
Clara rolled her
but
eyes.
now it was as if it
Let me
came from
guess.
all directions.
The footprints lead
The
to an
air around
underground
him
lair
seemed
where
to warp,
monsters wait to feast
bending
on foolish
reality.
tourists.
The walls felt
But Matthew
closer,
wasn't laughing.
the floor
He'd been
beneath him
silent all
unstable.
evening, his eyes
A
darting
cold
to the
gust of
windows
wind
every
blew
few
through the
minutes.
room, despite the
"I
windows
heard
being
something,"
shut tight.
he said suddenly.
He could hear the
The
whispers
group fell
again,
silent.
louder this time.
"What did you hear?"
But these weren't
Ivan
just
asked,
whispers.
his voice tense.
They were words,
"A
muffled
laugh,"
but clear enough
Matthew
for him to
whispered.
understand.
A child's laugh.
Come closer. She's
The
waiting.
laughter grew louder as the night
He shook
deepened.
his head,
A
his
high-pitched
vision
giggle
blurring.
that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere.
No,
Ivan tried to convince
This
the group
isn't
to
real.
leave, but the
This can't
snowstorm
be
outside
happening.
had worsened, trapping
but
them
when he
inside
looked
the
back
cabin.
at the closet,
Matthew,
the woman's
unable to
face
sit
was
still,
inches from
began
his own,
pacing.
her breath cold
"It's
and
testing
foul,
us," he
a
muttered.
smell of
"It
decay
knows we're
lingering in
here,
the air.
and it's playing with
The
us."
voice that had once been
"Who's
Emma's
playing
had
with us?"
twisted into
Clara
something
demanded,
darker.
her bravado faltering.
She's waiting, Alex.
"The thing that leaves the
She's
footprints,"
always been here.
Matthew said, his voice
She never
hollow.
left.
The scratching began
In that
just after
moment,
midnight.
Alex felt the
It
weight of
started
the
at the
house
windows,
press in on him.
moved to the walls, and
the
then to the
floors,
door.
the air around him.
Ivan grabbed a knife
It
from
all
his
seemed
pack,
alive,
while Greta clutched
shifting,
a flashlight.
tightening.
"Whatever's out
And that
there,
voice,
it's not getting in,"
that whisper,
Ivan said,
it was everywhere.
his knuckles white
The
around
house
the
was
blade.
alive and it was hungry.
But as the scratching
Without
grew louder,
thinking,
more
Alex
frantic,
bolted from the
the door
room, his
began to
pulse
creak.
pounding in his ears.
"Don't open it,"
He didn't care
Greta
what was
warned as
chasing
Matthew
him
moved toward the
or
door.
who had spoken those words.
But Matthew was
He
transfixed.
just needed to
The
get
scratching
out.
stopped,
But as
replaced
he
by a
turned
soft,
to run
melodic
down the
voice.
hallway, the floor
"Help
beneath
me.
him seemed to shift,
Please."
the ground buckling, as though
Matthew
the
reached
house
for the
was
handle.
twisting and warping, trapping
"Stop,"
him inside.
Ivan shouted, pulling him back.
The door to
but
the
it was too
stairs
late.
slammed shut
The
before he
door
could reach
flew
it.
open, and the storm
He
rushed
tried
in,
to turn the knob,
extinguishing the
but
heater
it was stuck,
and plunging
as
the
if the
cabin
house
into
itself
darkness.
was refusing to let him leave.
Chaos erupted.
He felt a surge
Clara
of panic
screamed
rise
as
in
the
his
wind
chest.
howled through the room,
The whispers
carrying
grew
with it a
louder,
strange,
now all around him,
unearthly
a
laughter.
cacophony of voices,
Greta's
angry
flashlight
and
flickered,
pleading.
revealing glimpses of the thing
Alex!
outside.
Alex!
It wasn't a child. It stood
The
hunched
voice
and
wasn't
twisted,
just Emma's
its
anymore.
elongated limbs
It
ending
was the
in
voices
clawed
of
hands
everyone
that
who had
scraped
ever lived
against
in this
the floor.
house. Everyone
Its
who
face
had
was
been
pale and
consumed by it.
featureless, save for a
He
wide,
heard his own
toothless
name
mouth
called out in a
that
thousand
stretched
different
impossibly
tones,
far.
1,000
The
different
creature
whispers.
lunged. In the
Some were
confusion,
filled with pain,
Ivan pushed Clara
others with
toward the back
rage,
of the cabin.
all of them
"Run!"
longing for
he
something,
shouted, slashing at the
something
creature
Alex
with his
didn't
knife.
understand,
Matthew
was
stood
beginning to fear.
frozen, staring at the thing
Emma!
as it crawled toward
He
him.
called again,
"It's
his
not
voice
real,"
cracking.
he whispered.
He had
"It
to
can't
find her.
be real."
He had to help
The creature reached him,
She
its
was
claws
still here,
wrapping around his leg.
somewhere.
He screamed as it
trapped
dragged him
just
toward
like he
the door.
was.
His cries
He
swallowed
turned
by
toward
the
the
storm.
attic door at the end of the
Clara
hallway.
and Greta managed
The
to escape
whispers
through a
seemed
side
to
window,
come from there,
the storm
from the
blinding
dark
them as they
space
stumbled
above.
into the snow.
The attic had always
Behind
been a
them,
place of
the cabin
mystery
glowed
and fear
faintly,
for him as a
as if
child,
lit from
a
within by an
place his
unnatural
parents had
light.
warned him never to
They
go.
didn't stop running
And
until
now,
they reached the tree line.
after all these years,
"What about
it was
Ivan?"
calling to him again.
Clara gasped, her chest heaving.
With a shaking hand,
Greta shook her head,
Alex reached
tears
for the
streaming
door,
down her face.
and just as his
"He's
fingers
gone."
brushed the handle,
Weeks
the door
later,
swung
Clara
open by
returned to the
itself,
Arctic, determined to
as if
uncover the
inviting
truth
him in.
about the frost-bitten cabin.
the air around him grew
But when she
colder,
arrived at its
a
location,
bitter
there was
frost
nothing
seeping
there.
into the floorboards
No
and
cabin,
up his legs,
no footprints,
chilling him to the
just
bone.
an endless expanse of snow.
He stepped inside.
And on the wind,
The
faint
attic was
but
shrouded in
unmistakable,
darkness,
was the sound
the
of a
only
child's
light coming
laughter.
from a small, flickering bulb
Clara stood
overhead.
motionless at the edge of the
The
Arctic
walls
expanse,
seemed to stretch higher than he
staring into the
remembered,
endless stretch
the
of
space
snow.
impossibly large.
The absence of the cabin made
And
her
there,
heart race.
in the center of the room,
It had been there.
was a
She
figure,
had seen it, had run
Emma,
from it.
or what
Yet
was
now,
left of her.
all that remained was an
She stood
unsettling
motionless,
emptiness.
facing away from him,
The
her head
child's
slightly
laughter whispered
tilted,
through the cold
her hair
wind
hanging
again,
in front of her
teasing
face.
and faint.
Her body was
It sent a
unnaturally
chill down
still,
Clara's spine,
and a deep,
not
unsettling
because of the sound
silence hung in the
itself,
air around
but
her.
because of the eerie familiarity
Alex's
in
heart
its tone.
thudded painfully in his chest.
The laugh seemed to mock her.
Emma,
Her breath
called
formed
softly,
plumes in the
his
freezing
voice
air
hoarse.
as she scanned the landscape,
Slowly, she turned
desperate
to
to
face
find a
him.
clue, anything
But it wasn't
that could
Emma
ground her.
anymore.
But her
Her
mind
face
was
was
playing
gaunt,
tricks on her,
her eyes
warping
wide
the distant
and hollow,
snowbanks
her
into
mouth
shapes that
stretched
almost
into a
looked like
grin that
hunched
didn't
figures.
belong to her.
She shook
Her
her
lips
head
were
and turned to
cracked,
the guide
a
who had
faint
brought her
trace
back
of
to this
blood
cursed
smeared
spot.
across her chin.
His name was Eric,
Alex,
a rugged man who had
I've been
dismissed the
waiting,
tales of the frostbitten
she
cabin
whispered,
as mere
her voice
folklore.
echoing with
But
1,000
even
different
Eric now
tones,
looked unsettled.
all of them pleading,
Are you
desperate.
sure this is the spot?
I've been waiting for you
Clara
to come
asked,
back,
her voice trembling.
for you to see the
I
truth.
don't understand.
Alex's
Eric
throat
muttered,
tightened,
his
his
voice
mind racing.
unusually soft.
He stepped back, but something
I've guided
inside him
expeditions
told
through
him
this region
that
for
he
years.
couldn't leave now.
The terrain doesn't
That
just
the house, whatever
change.
it was, wasn't going
It
to
was
let him
here,
go until he
Clara
understood,
insisted, panic creeping
until
into
he
her
knew
tone.
the truth.
The cabin was right here. I
The
saw it. I
truth?
ran from it.
He asked, barely able to
Eric's
breathe.
gaze hardened.
What do you
You're
mean?
sure?
Emma,
Yes, Clara
where are
snapped.
you?
And I'm not leaving
What's
until we
happening?
find it.
The figure of
Hours
his
passed
sister
as they
reached out
searched the
toward him,
surrounding area.
her long fingers
Clara's
stretching,
desperation grew
impossibly
with
long.
every passing minute.
Her nails
She
were cracked
retraced her
and yellow,
steps,
and
even
as they
pulled out a
touched his
map
arm,
and GPS
an
to
icy
confirm her
chill
location.
shot through him,
The cabin
burning
had
his
existed.
skin.
She wasn't crazy.
You can't escape,
But as the
she
sky began
whispered,
to dim
her voice
and the
becoming
pale sun
distorted.
sank lower,
1,000 voices
Eric
blended
insisted
into one.
they leave.
No one ever
It's
leaves.
dangerous to stay out
No
here
one.
after dark, he warned.
And then
This
the room
storm is
around him
picking
began
up,
to shift
and the
again.
temperatures will drop fast.
The walls seemed to pulse,
Clara hesitated,
bending and
her resolve
stretching as though the
weakening.
house itself was alive,
As much as she hated to
breathing,
admit it,
swallowing
she was terrified
everything
of
around
being
him.
caught out in the open.
The floor beneath him
The storm
cracked
carried
open,
a sharp,
revealing
biting
the
wind,
darkness below,
and the darkness
a
felt far
gaping
too
abyss
oppressive.
that threatened to pull him under.
Reluctantly, she agreed to return to their camp.
The figure of Emma screamed.
That night,
But it
as
wasn't
Clara
Emma
sat
anymore.
by the fire,
It was the
she couldn't
house,
shake the sensation
the
of being
voices,
watched.
the spirits trapped
Eric had
inside,
retired to his
all
tent,
calling to him,
leaving her alone
dragging
with her
him
thoughts.
closer to the edge.
The Arctic wind howled
He
outside,
screamed,
but
trying
beneath
to
it was
pull
another
away,
sound,
but it was too
a
late.
faint scratching.
The darkness
Clara
consumed
froze,
him,
her
the
hand
cold
gripping her
suffocating him.
She held
And
her
in
breath,
that moment,
straining to hear.
Alex realized
Scratch,
that there was no
scratch.
escaping.
It was faint but
The house
deliberate,
had claimed him,
coming from somewhere
just like it
beyond
had
the light of the
claimed so
fire.
many before him.
Her pulse quickened as
And
she
now,
scanned the shadows.
He was part of it,
Eric,
trapped
called
forever
softly, her
in the
voice
twisted
trembling.
labyrinth of its walls.
No response.
The darkness
She reached
seemed to
for a
swallow
flashlight,
Alex
her
whole,
fingers shaking as she
pulling
clicked
him
it on.
deeper into its cold,
The beam of light
suffocating
cut through the
grip.
darkness,
His
illuminating
body
the snow
felt as if
just
it was
beyond
no
the
longer
camp.
his, weighed down
At
by an
first,
oppressive
there was
force
nothing,
that numbed
just
his
an
limbs.
empty expanse of white.
His breath came in
Then
ragged
she saw them.
gasps, his chest
Footprints.
tight. But
They
no
were
matter
small,
how hard he struggled,
impossibly small,
he
like
could not
those of
free
a child.
himself.
And they
The
were
world
fresh.
around him was nothing but a blur of
Clara's
shadow
stomach
and
churned.
cold.
The memories
And
of
then
that night
a
at the
voice,
cabin came
soft,
rushing back.
distant,
The laughter,
spoke
the
to him
scratching,
from the depths
the
of the
creature.
black void.
She scrambled
It
to
was
her
a
feet and
voice that
stumbled toward
sounded
Eric's
both
tent,
familiar
throwing
and
open the
foreign
flap.
at once,
Eric,
like
wake
a
up!
memory that just
She hissed.
eluded his grasp.
Eric stirred groggily.
Alex,
What
the
is it?
voice whispered.
There's
His
something
heart
out there,
skipped a beat.
Clara whispered.
It sounded like Emma,
Eric sat up,
but
his
no,
expression hardening
it
as he
couldn't be.
grabbed his flashlight and rifle.
she was gone.
He stepped outside
was
with
part
Clara
of this
close
nightmare.
behind, the two of them
Yet
scanning the
The
area.
voice was unmistakable.
The footprints were gone.
Emma! He
I
rasped,
swear they
his
were
voice
right
shaking
there,
with desperation.
Clara said, her voice
The darkness
shaking.
seemed to pulse as if in
Eric
response,
frowned.
and the temperature
You're
around him
tired.
dropped even further,
Maybe the snow played
until he
tricks on
felt
you.
as though his very soul
No,
was being
Clara
frozen.
insisted, her voice rising.
A figure
I saw
appeared in
them.
the distance,
Eric's
a
gaze
pale
softened.
silhouette,
But before
a
he could
faint
respond,
outline in the
a
shadows.
sound cut through the wind.
It was Emma,
A low, guttural
or at least
growl.
the thing that used to be her.
The growl sent a jolt of
She
terror
stood there,
through Clara.
her figure
Eric
shifting and
spun
flickering,
toward the sound, his
like a
flashlight
flame
shaking in his
struggling to
grip.
stay lit in a
The beam of
violent
light
wind.
fell on something in the
Her
distance.
eyes were empty
A
voids,
dark,
and her
hunched
mouth hung
figure.
open in a silent scream.
What the hell is that?
She
Eric
reached for
muttered,
him,
raising
her
his
hands
rifle.
stretching
The
unnaturally
figure didn't
long,
move, but its
her
presence was
fingers crooked
undeniable.
and distorted,
It was taller
as
than
though they
any
were
human,
trying to
its
grab him
elongated
from the
limbs
very
casting
fabric of
grotesque
reality.
shadows on the snow.
No,
Clara's heart pounded as she recognized
Alex's
the
voice
silhouette.
cracked.
It's
I
the
don't
thing
want
from
this.
the cabin, she
I
whispered.
don't want to be here.
Eric glanced at her,
But
confusion
the figure
flashing
continued
in
its
his eyes.
approach,
Stay
its
behind
footsteps
me.
barely making a
He took a
sound.
cautious step
The
forward.
closer it got,
the rifle
the
trained
colder
on the
the
figure.
air became,
But as the
until
flashlight's
Alex
beam moved
felt
closer,
as though his heart
the figure
itself
vanished,
would freeze.
dissolving into the shadows like
You
mist.
can't leave, she
What the-
whispered,
Eric
though
began,
it wasn't her voice
but
anymore.
his words were cut off as the
It
ground
was the
beneath
house
them
speaking
trembled.
through her,
The snow erupted
its
in front
icy
of them,
tendrils
and the creature
wrapping around his
emerged,
mind,
its twisted form
controlling
more
her
horrifying
movements.
than Clara remembered.
You
Its
belong
pale,
to us
featureless
now,
face
Alex,
turned toward them,
just like
and its
everyone
mouth
else who has
stretched
come
into
before
an
you.
impossible grin.
Alex's
Eric
chest
fired,
tightened as
the
the weight
shot
of her
echoing
words
through the
sank
night.
in.
The bullet
The
struck the
house,
creature, but it didn't
The
even
house had
flinch.
claimed Emma.
Instead, it lunged
now
toward Eric,
it
its
was
clawed
claiming him
hand
too.
swiping through the air.
No!
"Run!"
He
Eric
shouted,
shouted,
his
shoving
voice
Clara
trembling.
backward.
I'm
Clara
not
stumbled,
staying
her
here.
instincts
I
taking
won't
over
be
as
like
she
them.
turned and fled.
But the
Behind
darkness
her, Eric's
laughed,
screams pierced
a
the night,
hollow,
followed by an
bone-chilling
eerie
sound that
silence.
echoed through his very soul.
Clara didn't stop running
The
until she
cold
collapsed,
deepened,
her lungs
gnawing
burning
at
and
him
her
from
legs
the
trembling.
inside out.
She looked back,
You have no choice,
but there was no sign of
the
the
voice
creature
of the house whispered.
or Eric.
No one ever does.
She was alone.
Alex struggled to
The
move,
wind carried a
his legs
familiar
heavy,
sound to her ears,
his body
a
frozen
high-pitched
by the
giggle.
icy air.
It sent
He
shivers
wanted
down
to
her
scream,
spine as she
to
realized
run,
the laughter was
but
closer
it was as
now,
though the very
circling
air
her
was
like a
keeping him in
predator.
place, holding
"Why
him
are you
captive.
doing this?"
He could
She
feel the
screamed into
pull,
the
a
darkness.
terrible pressure,
The
forcing
laughter
him
stopped.
deeper into the
A
abyss.
voice, soft and melodic,
As the figure
answered.
of Emma, or whatever
"You
was
called
left
to
of her,
us."
came closer, her
The
face twisted
realization
into
hit
something
Clara like a
monstrous,
thunderbolt.
her mouth
Her
open
return
wide,
to the Arctic,
too wide,
her
as
obsession
if
with
she
the
was
cabin,
trying to swallow him
it had
whole.
drawn the entity to
You'll
her.
join us, she
As the
hissed,
wind howled and the
her
shadows
voice no
closed
longer
in,
human.
Clara understood the truth.
We'll never leave you, Alex.
She had become part of the
You're one of
frostbitten
us
cabin
now.
story.
In that
this
moment,
time,
Alex felt an
there would be
overwhelming
no
sense
escape.
of dread, of finality.
Clara sank to
This
her
was
knees,
it.
trembling,
There was no
her
escape.
breath visible in the
He was
frigid air.
trapped, forever
The voice
bound
had
to this
felt like it
place,
came from
a part of it
everywhere
now,
and nowhere,
just like the
wrapping
others who
around
had
her
vanished
like a
before him.
suffocating shroud.
His body went
The
numb,
silence that followed
the
was
icy
worse
grip
than the voice
tightening
itself.
around him until he couldn't feel
The
anything
Arctic
at
wind
all.
no longer howled.
And
It
then,
whispered
as if
now,
the house
as
had
if the
finished
very
with
air
him,
around
the
her
darkness
carried the
began to
entity's
recede.
presence.
The pressure
Her
released.
mind raced.
The
She couldn't
whispers
stop
faded
hearing
into
its words.
silence.
"You
But
called
Alex
to us."
didn't feel relief.
"No,"
No,
she muttered,
he felt a
clutching her
new,
head,
deep,
trying
unsettling
to block
presence.
out the ringing echoes
Something
of the voice.
far worse than the cold.
"I didn't.
Something far worse
didn't call
than the
anyone."
darkness. He
But deep
opened his
down,
eyes,
she knew that
and
wasn't
for the
entirely
briefest
true.
moment,
The cabin
the
had
world
lingered in
felt
her mind
real
for
again.
years, haunting her thoughts,
he was
fueling
standing
her
in the
obsession
attic.
to return.
The light
Every
flickered
step
above him,
she'd taken to come back
casting
here
long
had
shadows
brought
on
her
the
closer
floor.
to this nightmare.
He could hear his own
The
breathing,
laughter returned,
ragged and shallow.
closer, sharper.
His heart thudded
more
painfully in his
childlike.
chest.
Clara spun around,
something was
searching for
wrong.
the source, her
He could
heart
feel it,
pounding in her chest.
deep in his
Her
bones.
flashlight flickered as she
The
aimed
room
it
wasn't the
wildly in
same.
every direction,
The walls
but the
had shifted.
shadows seemed to dance
The floor
just
was
out of
cracked
reach.
and uneven.
"Who are
The
you?"
space was
she screamed,
wrong.
her voice breaking.
The air was heavy with
No
something he
response
couldn't
came,
quite explain.
only the soft crunch
Something
of
thick and
footsteps in the snow
suffocating.
behind her.
He turned
Clara
to the
whipped
corner of the
around,
room, and his
but there
breath
was
caught
nothing
in his
there.
throat.
The snow was
There,
untouched,
in the farthest
pristine.
corner, was a
The
dark
footsteps
shape,
continued, this
a
time
figure,
to her left.
tall and twisted,
She turned again,
watching him.
only to find more emptiness.
For a moment he thought it
Her
was
breathing
Emma,
quickened.
but no,
"Please,
this thing was
just
different.
leave me alone."
It was a shadow,
A small figure
its
emerged
features
from the
distorted
shadows,
and shifted,
stepping into the dim
like
light
a
of her
nightmare that
flickering
refused
flashlight.
to be named.
Clara froze
Emma.
as she saw it.
He whispered,
A
his
child,
voice barely
no
a
older than
breath.
7 or 8, wearing a
But the
tattered
figure
coat
didn't
far
answer.
too thin for the Arctic
It didn't
cold.
move.
The child's
It
face
simply
was
stood
pale,
there,
almost
its eyes glowing
translucent,
faintly in the
and
dark.
their eyes,
Alex's
they were
heart skipped a
black.
beat. The air
entirely
grew
black,
colder once again,
devoid of
the chill
emotion
creeping
or
into his
humanity.
very bones.
"Help
The
me,"
thing in the corner
child
began
said,
to move,
their voice
its
trembling.
limbs stretching and jerking
Clara's
in
heart ached
unnatural
for a
ways.
moment, a maternal
It was coming
instinct tugging
closer.
at her even through her
Without
fear.
thinking, Alex
But something
turned
was
and
wrong,
bolted toward the door.
terribly wrong.
The house seemed
The
to
child's
stretch
lips
with
didn't
him,
move in
the
sync
walls
with the
closing
words.
in,
It was as though
the
the
hallway
voice came
growing
from somewhere
longer and
else,
longer
using
with
the
every
child as a
step.
puppet.
He could feel the floor beneath him shifting
I
again,
can't,
the
Clara
entire
stammered,
house
stepping back.
shaking, groaning
The child
as
tilted
though
their
it were
head,
alive.
the motion unnaturally sharp,
Behind
and
him
smiled.
the thing, no,
It wasn't a child's
the
smile.
creature
It was wide,
was coming closer,
grotesque, stretching far
footsteps
beyond what
soft,
should have been possible.
almost too quiet to hear.
"You can't leave."
But
the child
Alex could
whispered.
feel it.
The
He
ground
could feel
beneath
its
Clara's
presence like a
feet
shadow,
shifted suddenly,
crawling
and
toward
she
him,
stumbled.
consuming everything in its
The snow
path.
seemed to ripple, as
Not
if it were
again,
alive.
He
Her
thought,
flashlight fell from her
terror
hands,
clawing at his
landing in the
chest.
snow and casting long,
He
erratic
reached the
shadows.
staircase, but the moment his
Clara
foot hit the
scrambled to
first
retrieve
step,
it,
the house
but her hands
trembled
were numb
violently.
and shaking.
The stairs cracked
When she
under his
looked up,
weight, and for a
The
moment,
child was gone.
Alex thought he was going to fall.
The laughter started again,
but no.
louder this time, coming
Instead,
from all
the
directions.
floor tilted,
Clara
the
clutched her
stairs
ears,
twisting at
trying to
unnatural
drown it
angles,
out, but it
as
only
if the
grew
house
louder,
itself was
piercing
trying to
her
swallow
skull
him
like
whole.
nails.
Panic
it!
surged
She
through
screamed,
Alex, but he had
tears
no
streaming
choice.
down her face.
He had to keep going.
Please stop.
He scrambled up
The
the
laughter
stairs,
ceased
trying
abruptly,
to outrun the
replaced
creature
by
that
the
was
guttural
closing in on him.
growl she had heard
He
earlier.
could feel its presence behind
Clara
him.
turned toward the
The air
sound, and her
growing
heart
colder,
nearly stopped.
heavier,
The creature
suffocating.
was there, towering over her.
With every step, the house
its
seemed to
elongated
grow
limbs
darker,
cast
the
jagged
shadows longer.
across the snow,
It was
and
closing
its
in on
featureless
him,
face seemed to
trapping
pulse,
him inside.
as if it were trying to
The
take
walls
shape.
pressed tighter, the whispers
Why me?
louder, and the
Clara
creature's
whispered,
steps echoed
barely
in
able
his
to form
mind.
the words.
Finally, he reached
The
the
creature
door at the
didn't
top
answer.
of the stairs.
It lunged toward
His
her,
hands shook
its
as he
clawed
tried to
hands
open it.
swiping through the air.
It was locked.
Clara screamed
He
and dove
yanked
to
at
the
the
side,
door,
narrowly
panic
avoiding
rising
its
in his
grasp.
throat.
She scrambled
He
to her
couldn't
feet
stop.
and ran, her boots
couldn't
sinking
let the
into the
creature
snow
catch
with
him.
every step.
He
The
had to
storm
get
had picked
out,
up again, the wind
but the
howling
door
and
wouldn't
blinding her
open.
with flurries of snow.
With
Clara
a scream
didn't know
of
where she was
frustration,
going.
Alex
She just
turned
knew
to
she had
face
to
the
get away.
creature. And then,
Her lungs burned,
just as he had
her legs
feared,
ached.
the thing
she
emerged
didn't
from the
stop.
shadows.
The
Its
growling
face
was
barely
behind her,
visible,
closer
but
now.
its eyes,
She didn't
those
dare
glowing
look back,
eyes,
afraid that
burned
seeing the
through
creature
him.
would paralyze her with fear.
Alex, it whispered.
Ahead, through the swirling
And in
snow,
that moment,
Clara saw a faint
Alex
light.
knew there was no
It was
escape.
distant, flickering
The house
like
had
a
already
beacon.
claimed him.
Hope surged through her chest.
Story 3.
Maybe it was another camp, or a rescue
The Christmas
team searching
season had
for her.
always been a time of
She pushed
warmth,
herself harder,
joy,
her feet
and
slipping
family.
and stumbling in the snow.
The air was
The
filled
light
with the
grew
smell
brighter,
of pine
closer,
and cinnamon,
until she could
the
make
sound
out
of
its
carolers
source.
singing, and the
Her
glow
heart
of
sank.
twinkling lights. It was a
the
season
cabin.
that brought people together,
The frostbitten
a time
cabin
to forget
stood in
the
the
worries
exact
of the
spot
world
where it had
and
vanished
focus
earlier,
on what
its
truly
windows
mattered.
glowing with an eerie
But for
golden
Sarah,
light.
this Christmas would be
Clara
different.
stopped in her tracks.
It would be
her
a
breath
Christmas
coming in
she would
ragged
never
gasps.
forget. A
creature's
Christmas that
growls
would
were right
haunt her
behind
for
her
the
now,
rest of her
But she
life.
couldn't bring herself to move.
It had started
The cabin
innocently
seemed
enough.
to call to her, pulling her forward
Sarah
against
and
her
her
will.
husband, Mark,
No,
had decided to spend
she
the
whispered,
holidays at a
shaking
cabin
her
in the
head.
mountains.
I'm not
It
going
was a
back in
small,
there.
secluded place,
The
the
growling
perfect
grew
getaway
louder,
from the hustle and
and
bustle
Clara
of city
realized
life.
she had no choice.
They had
If
rented
she
it
stayed
through a
outside, the
website,
creature would tear
and
her
from the
apart.
photos, it looked
The
charming,
cabin might be a trap, but it was
cozy,
her only chance.
with a stone fireplace and a
With
beautiful
trembling
view
legs,
of the
she
snow-covered
forced
mountains.
herself to move, each
When
step
they
feeling
arrived,
heavier than
the
the
cabin
last.
was even more
She
picturesque
reached the
than they had
door and
imagined.
hesitated for a moment,
The snow
her
was
hand
falling
hovering over
gently,
the handle.
covering the
The
ground in a
growling was
soft white
deafening
blanket.
now, accompanied
The
by the
air
sound
was
of
crisp
crunching
and fresh,
snow as the
and
creature
the only
closed
sounds
in.
were the crunch of snow underfoot
Clara took a deep
and the
breath
distant call
and
of a
yanked the
bird.
door open,
It
throwing
was the
herself
perfect
inside.
setting for a peaceful Christmas.
The warmth of the cabin enveloped her
However,
immediately, a stark
there was something
contrast
off
to
about
the
the
icy
cabin
cold
from the
outside.
moment they stepped
The door
inside.
slammed shut behind her,
The
and the
interior was
growling
much
ceased.
colder than it should have been,
Clara collapsed
despite
to
the
floor,
fireplace
her body
crackling warmly
trembling.
in the living room.
She was safe,
The walls seemed to
now.
creak and groan,
but as she
as
looked
though
around,
the house itself were
she
alive,
realized the cabin was
shifting
different.
and sighing with
The
every
walls
movement.
seemed to pulse,
But Sarah
the wooden
brushed it
beams
off.
creaking as though they were
It was
alive.
an old cabin after all.
The furniture was covered in
A
a
little
thick layer
noise
of
here and
frost,
there was to be
and
expected.
the air was heavy with the scent
They
of
unpacked
decay.
their things, decorated the
Clara's
tree,
gaze fell on
and
the
settled in
fireplace,
for the night.
where a single figure
The
sat in the
snowstorm
chair she
outside grew
remembered
stronger,
all too well.
and they were happy to be
The
inside,
old man.
safe and warm.
His empty eye sockets turned toward
Mark
her,
poured them both a
and a
glass of
twisted
wine,
smile spread
and they
across
sat
his
by the
face.
fire, talking about their
"Welcome
plans
back,"
for Christmas dinner
he rasped,
and enjoying the
his voice
peacefulness
like
of their
ice
surroundings.
scraping against metal.
But as the evening wore
Story
on,
6.
Sarah began to feel uneasy.
Winter had always been Jenna's favorite
It was a
season.
strange, gnawing
The crisp
sensation
air, the
that she
silence of
couldn't
the
shake,
snow,
like
and
someone
the way the world felt
or
softer
something
somehow.
was watching her.
But this winter was
At
different.
first, she thought it
There
was
was an
just the
oppressive
isolation
stillness
of
in
the
the air,
cabin playing tricks
a
on her
heaviness
mind,
that made her chest tighten
the
whenever
feeling
she
grew
stepped
stronger,
outside.
more
The
persistent.
small town she lived in,
She
nestled
would
deep in
glance
the
over her
mountains,
shoulder,
had been covered
certain
in
that
snow
she saw
for weeks.
movement out of the corner
And
of her
while
eye.
it should have been picturesque,
But when she
it
turned,
felt suffocating
the
instead.
room was empty.
The isolation was part of the
"Are
charm,
you okay?"
Jenna told
Mark
herself
asked,
as she made her
noticing
way
her
back
sudden
from the
change in
local
demeanor.
store, her boots crunching in
Sarah
the snow.
nodded, forcing a
She had
smile.
moved here to escape the chaos
"I'm
of the
fine.
city, trading traffic
Just a
noise
little
for
tired,
the
I
quiet of
guess."
pine trees and mountain views.
But she wasn't fine.
Her cabin was a
She
good
felt it
mile
more
from the
than ever
nearest
now.
neighbor,
A presence
but she
in the
didn't
room,
mind.
an energy
liked
that
the
didn't
solitude.
belong.
Or
She couldn't
she used
explain
to.
it, but the house seemed
The
wrong.
first strange thing happened
The
2
longer
nights
they
ago.
stayed, the the more it
She'd
felt
been
like
lying
they
in
were
bed,
intruding on
the
something
wind
ancient,
howling outside,
something
when
that
she
didn't
heard
want
it.
them there.
a faint muffled cry.
As the night went on,
It wasn't the sound of the
storm
wind or the
outside
creaking
worsened.
of the trees.
The wind
It was
howled,
distinct,
rattling the
human,
windows,
and
and the
undeniably
snow
close.
piled up against the
She had
door.
convinced herself it was her
They were
imagination.
completely cut off
The
from
wind
the
played
world,
tricks on people,
stuck in this
especially
cabin
in
with
the dead
only
of
each
night.
other for company.
But the next
The
morning,
power flickered a
when
few
she stepped
times,
outside to fetch
but each
firewood,
time it came back
she found
on.
something that made her blood
Still,
run cold.
The unease in Sarah's chest
There,
only grew.
in the snow beneath her bedroom
That
window,
night,
were
as they
footprints,
settled into bed,
small
the
ones,
air in the room grew
bare
colder.
feet,
Mark,
and they led away from
already
the cabin,
asleep beside
disappearing
her,
into the forest.
didn't seem to notice.
Jenna couldn't stop
Sarah could
staring
feel
at
it.
them, her breath
Something was
visible
watching
in the
her from
freezing
the
air.
shadows.
The prints
She
were
lay there in the
impossibly close
darkness,
to the house.
unable to sleep.
She'd heard no one,
her mind
seen
racing.
no one.
Suddenly,
Who would be wandering barefoot
she heard a faint
in the
sound,
snow,
a
in
soft
temperatures
creaking,
cold enough to freeze
like
flesh
footsteps
in
in the
minutes.
hallway.
Her
Her heart
mind
skipped a
raced with
beat.
possibilities.
The cabin was old,
Maybe
but
it
the
was a
floors were
prank.
thick.
Maybe
the
one of
kind
the
creaks
locals
and
was messing
groans
with
that
her,
came from
though they'd
age,
been nothing but
not
kind
from
since
someone
she'd
walking
moved in.
around.
Or maybe
The
it was a
footsteps
lost
grew
child,
louder, closer,
though that thought
until
felt
they
even
were
more
right outside
unsettling.
their door. Sarah's
grip,
breath caught in her
She
throat.
muttered to herself,
She turned
forcing
toward
her legs
Mark,
to move.
but he was
She
still
needed
asleep,
to get back inside.
completely unaware
The
of the
rest of the
creeping
day
dread
passed
that filled the
uneventfully,
room.
though Jenna couldn't shake
door
the
handle
unease
slowly
that crept under
turned.
her skin.
Sarah held
She
her breath,
double-checked the locks on her
straining to
doors
hear.
and windows that night,
She couldn't move,
something she'd never
couldn't
bothered to do
speak.
before.
The door
As she
creaked
lay in
open
bed,
ever so
staring
slightly,
at the dark ceiling,
just enough for her to
she
see
told
a
herself
shadow
there was
in the dim
nothing to
light.
worry about.
But it
She was
wasn't
safe.
Mark. It wasn't anyone
But when
she
the crying
recognized.
started again,
It was a
closer
tall
this time,
figure, cloaked
her
in
heart
black,
nearly stopped.
with hollow, empty eyes
It was
staring at her
unmistakable
from the
now.
darkness.
A soft, pitiful
Mark,
wailing that
Sarah
came
whispered,
from just outside.
but her voice barely escaped her
Jenna
throat.
sat up, her body
The
rigid,
figure stepped
her
forward,
ears
its
straining to
movement
catch
slow
every sound.
and deliberate.
The crying
It
rose
was like
and
it was
fell,
waiting for something,
carrying an eerie
as though it
rhythm
knew
that made her
Sarah could do
stomach
nothing
churn.
but watch in terror.
She debated what to do.
The air grew
Calling
colder
the
still.
police seemed
The
ridiculous.
room now filled
They'd
with
laugh
the
at her for being
unmistakable
scared of the
presence
wind,
of death itself.
but ignoring it felt
And
impossible.
then, just as
What
suddenly
if it
as
really
it
was a
appeared,
child?
the figure
What
was
if someone
gone.
needed help?
The door slammed
Finally,
shut.
she threw on her
Sarah
coat,
gasped for
grabbed
air,
the
her
flashlight,
heart pounding
and
in her
opened
chest.
the front door.
She shook Mark awake,
The icy
her
wind
hands
bit at
trembling.
her skin as she stepped
Mark,
out onto the porch.
wake up.
Her breath
Something's
forming
in the
clouds
house.
in the air.
Mark
Hello?
groggily sat up,
She
looking
called,
at her with
her
confusion.
voice shaking.
What?
The crying stopped
What are you
abruptly.
talking about?
Jenna's flashlight
Sarah
swept
pointed
across
to the
the
door,
snow-covered
her
yard,
voice shaky.
illuminating the trees that
There's
stood
someone
like
in the
sentinels
house.
around her cabin.
I saw them. They were
Nothing
standing
moved.
right there.
The world was silent,
Mark looked at the door,
save for the
then
sound
back
of
at
her
her.
own breathing.
There's no one here,
Then,
Sarah.
out of the
It's
corner of her
probably
eye,
just the storm
she
messing
saw
with
it.
your head.
Movement
You're
near the edge
imagining
of the
things.
forest.
But
Who's
Sarah
there?
knew what she
she
had
demanded, the beam of her flashlight
still
trembling
feel the
as she
presence in
aimed
the
it
room.
toward the trees.
The coldness that lingered,
At first, she saw
the
nothing,
way the air seemed to hum with
but
tension.
then, slowly,
She
a
knew she
figure
wasn't
emerged.
imagining it.
It was
She
small,
wasn't crazy.
hunched,
The next day,
and as it
despite
stepped
the
into the
storm
light,
still raging
Jenna's heart
outside,
clenched.
Sarah and Mark
It was a
decided to
child.
leave.
A little girl,
They
no
packed
older
their
than
bags
6,
quickly,
wearing a
anxious
thin
to
white
get away
dress
from the
that was
cabin that had
completely
started to feel
inappropriate
more
for the
like a
freezing
tomb
weather.
than a home.
Her hair hung in dark,
But as
matted
they tried to
strands,
open the
and
door,
her
they
face
found
was
it wouldn't
pale,
budge.
almost blue.
The snow
But it was
outside
her
had
eyes
piled
that
up so
froze
high
Jenna in
against the
place.
door that it was
They were
completely
empty,
blocked.
hollow sockets that stared
They were
back
trapped.
at her, as if they could still
Panic
see.
set in. Mark
"Help
tried
me,"
to push the door
the
open,
girl whispered,
but it wouldn't
her
move.
voice hoarse and broken.
Sarah stood by,
Jenna couldn't
watching in
speak.
horror as the door
She couldn't
remained
move.
immovable.
The girl
The
stepped
house had
closer,
trapped them,
her bare feet
just like it
leaving
had
no
trapped
prints in
everyone
the
before
snow.
them.
Panic surged
As the
through
hours
Jenna,
passed, the
breaking
temperature
paralysis that
inside the
held her.
cabin dropped even
She
further.
stumbled back into the
They
cabin,
lit the
slamming
fireplace,
the door shut
but it
and
did
locking
little
it.
to combat the chill.
Her heart pounded in her chest
then,
as she backed away,
as night
her
fell again,
flashlight clattering to the
Sarah
floor.
heard it.
The crying started
footsteps,
again, louder
Closer
this time,
now, coming
and it was
down the
coming
stairs,
from right
the
outside
unmistakable
the door.
sound of someone
Jenna
or
clamped
something
her hands over
moving
her
through
ears,
the
but
cabin.
the sound seemed to seep
Sarah
into
felt
her
her
skull,
stomach churn.
relentless
She
and
could
piercing.
hear the figure, its
"Go
footsteps
away,"
growing louder,
she
getting
screamed,
closer and
tears
closer.
streaming down her
And
face.
then, as the footsteps
me
reached the
alone.
living room, Sarah saw
crying
it again.
stopped.
The tall figure,
Silence pressed
cloaked
down
in
on
black,
her like a weight,
standing in the doorway.
heavy and suffocating.
Its eyes glowed in the darkness,
Jenna waited,
empty
her breath
and lifeless,
hitching, her body
staring at her
trembling.
with a gaze that sent a
Minutes
cold
passed.
shiver down her spine.
Then from behind her she heard the
tried to
faint
scream,
creak of a floorboard.
but no sound came
She
out.
spun around, but
The
there was
figure
nothing
stepped
there.
forward, its
The
movement
cabin was
slow
dark,
and
the
deliberate.
only light coming from the dying embers
"Sarah,"
of the fireplace.
it whispered,
"Hello?"
and just Just like
she
that,
whispered,
the world
her
went
voice
black.
barely audible.
Mark never
A
saw
shadow
Sarah
shifted in the
again,
corner of the room.
and the cabin,
It was subtle,
hidden deep in the
almost
mountains,
imperceptible.
continues to trap
But
anyone
Jenna
who
saw
dares
it.
to step inside.
She grabbed a poker from the
No
fireplace,
one knows what happened
holding
to
it
them.
in front of her like a weapon.
No one knows what it is that haunts the
there?
house.
The
But
shadow
one
moved
thing is
again,
certain:
slithering along
the
the
spirit
wall
of
like
Christmas
liquid darkness.
is long gone.
It stretched and
As the days
morphed,
passed,
taking
the
shape
storm
until it
outside
resembled the little
raged
girl.
on,
But
fierce
this
and
time,
unrelenting.
there was something more
Mark
grotesque
was left in the
about her.
cabin alone,
Her limbs
the
were too
absence
long,
of Sarah's voice
her
haunting
head
the cold
tilted
walls.
at an
He
unnatural
searched
angle,
every
and her
inch
mouth,
of the cabin,
it
calling her
stretched
name
impossibly
over
wide,
and over, but
revealing
there was
rows
no
of
answer.
jagged teeth.
No sign of her.
"You let us in!" The
The
creature
wind
hissed,
howled
its
through the
voice
broken
overlapping
windows,
with the cries of
and
many
the eerie
others.
silence of the cabin pressed
Jenna
down
backed
on
away,
him like a
her
heavy
legs
weight.
shaking so badly she could barely
Desperation
stand.
set in.
"No,
With the
I
door still
didn't,"
blocked by the thick
she stammered,
snowdrifts,
her grip
Mark was
tightening on the
trapped.
poker.
He felt as though the
creature
house
advanced,
itself was
its
suffocating
hollow eyes
him,
boring into
pulling
her.
him deeper into
You
its
heard
web
us.
of darkness and
You
despair.
called us, and now
He tried to
we
make a
are
plan,
here.
to think clearly,
Jenna's scream
but the
echoed through
images
the
of
cabin
Sarah's
as the
terrified
shadows
face haunted
closed
him
in,
at every turn.
swallowing the light,
What had
the
happened
warmth,
to her?
and her
Where
desperate
had she
cries for
gone?
help.
The figure in black.
The next morning,
He couldn't
the
shake
cabin
the
stood
memory of
silent,
its hollow eyes and
surrounded by
cold voice.
pristine snow.
He knew deep
The
down
locals would later
that it was
say they
no
never saw
ordinary
Jenna again.
spirit. It was
But
something
sometimes
far
on
darker,
cold, windy nights,
far more
they
sinister.
could hear faint cries
The
coming from
cabin,
the
he
woods,
realized, was
a
not
soft,
just an
pitiful
ordinary
wailing
house.
that sent
It
shivers
was a
down their
prison,
spines.
and it
No
had been
one
waiting
dared
for someone
investigate,
like him.
and no one ever returned
As
to
the
that
hours
cabin.
turned into days, Mark's
After Jenna's
sense of time
disappearance,
began
the
to
small
blur.
town felt the weight of
The cold
unease.
was unbearable, seeping
Whispers
into his
surrounded
bones.
the cabin at the edge of the woods.
His only source
where
of
the wind
warmth was the
howled
dying
endlessly,
fire in the
and
hearth,
shadows seemed to shift
but even that felt
unnaturally.
futile against the chill
Though
that seemed to
most
come
dismissed
from
it
within the
as
very walls
superstition.
themselves.
Those who ventured
Every
too
night,
close at night
the figure
spoke of
appeared
soft,
again.
distant cries,
Its
echoing
footsteps
through the
echoed
trees.
through the cabin,
It
drawing
was
nearer,
unsettling,
always
but no
lurking
one
just
dared
out of
speak
sight.
of it too loudly.
Mark tried to barricade
Sarah,
himself
a
in the
newcomer,
upstairs bedroom,
had heard the
but it
stories
was
but
useless.
brushed them aside as mere
The figure
ghost
found him
tales.
every time,
But
its
one late
presence like a
afternoon,
shadow,
she found herself
ever-present
standing before
and
the cabin,
suffocating.
curiosity
He could
pulling
hear it
her in.
whispering his name,
As she
a voice
approached,
like nails
a
on a
chill crawled
chalkboard,
up her spine.
sending shivers of
The
dread through
windows
his
were
body.
dark, the door slightly
wasn't
ajar,
just after
inviting
Sarah.
her in.
It was after
Despite
him,
the
too.
creeping dread,
The
Sarah
more time
pressed on,
passed,
her
the more
footsteps
Mark
muffled
felt
in
like
the
he
thick
was
snow.
losing his grip on reality.
Inside, the cabin was
He began to
eerily
hear
still,
voices,
untouched by time.
soft murmurs in the walls,
The air was thick,
like people
cold,
whispering just
and the
beyond his
fireplace
reach.
had long since died.
Sometimes, he
Then
would
she
wake
heard
up
it,
in the middle of the night to
soft
find
crying,
the furniture
like a
rearranged,
child weeping
or
from another
objects
room.
moved,
It
as
grew
if the
louder
cabin
as she
itself
approached.
was alive and watching
Her
him.
heart pounded,
It was as
her
though the
flashlight
house was
trembling in her
alive,
hands.
feeding off
She
his
called
fear,
out softly, but
growing
the crying
stronger
stopped.
with every
For a
passing
moment, everything was still.
Then, one
But
night,
then, a
the
figure
figure came
appeared in the
again.
dim light.
Mark
the
was
same
sitting
little
by the
girl who
dying
had vanished
fire,
with
his
Jenna.
eyes heavy with
Her
exhaustion.
face was pale and
The
obscured
wind
by
outside
tangled hair,
howled as the snow
eyes hollow with
continued to
sadness
fall in
and malice.
thick, heavy flakes.
"Help me,"
But inside,
the girl
there was an
whispered.
unnatural
Her
stillness.
voice seemed broken.
The figure appeared
distant.
in the doorway, its
Fear
dark form
gripped
like a
Sarah
shadow
as the
against the
temperature
faint
dropped,
glow of the
her
fire.
breath visible in
Mark
the frigid
froze, unable to
air. "Who
move,
are you?" she
unable
whispered,
to speak.
barely able to speak.
His breath came in shallow
Without
gasps
warning,
as the
the
figure
girl's mouth
stepped into the
opened
room.
wide, revealing
This
jagged
time,
teeth.
there was no
"You
whispering.
should have left."
The figure
she
was
hissed.
silent, its hollow
called
eyes
us.
fixed on Mark with an
The room
unsettling
shifted,
intensity.
shadows moving
Slowly,
like living creatures.
it raised one
the
long
air
skeletal
thickening.
hand and pointed
Sarah
at him.
realized she had walked into
Mark's
something
heart
ancient
pounded in his
and
chest
dark.
as the room grew
The
even
shadows
colder,
grew, wrapping around
the
her.
air thick
The
with a
child's
sense
form
of dread.
morphing into something monstrous.
He tried to move,
"You belong
but his
to us
body
now,"
refused to
it
obey,
rasped, its
as
voice
if it
a
were
chorus
frozen
of
in
whispers.
place by the figure's
Sarah
gaze.
stumbled backward, the
"You are
darkness
not
closing
welcome
in.
here."
The voices,
The figure
twisted
finally
and pleading,
spoke,
surrounded her.
its
She
voice
ran,
low and
desperately
hollow,
trying to reach the door.
reverberating through the
It
room.
wouldn't open. The shadows
never
slithered
have
around
been.
her, pressing in, choking her
The
breath.
words sent a shiver of terror
Just
through
as the
Mark.
cold fingers of the
He
creature
tried to
touched
speak,
her,
to
the
beg
door
for
burst
answers,
open,
but the
and
words
she was
caught in
thrown
his
into
throat.
the snow outside.
The figure took another step
The
forward,
daylight was blinding,
its black
but
cloak
the creature's
swirling around
cries
it like a
followed her,
dark mist.
distant yet close.
Mark could feel the
She ran,
coldness radiating
heart
from it,
pounding,
chilling
knowing
him
the
to the
shadows
bone.
would never let her go.
Suddenly, there was
Later,
a loud crash
they
from
found
upstairs.
her in the snow, eyes
Mark's heart
wide
skipped a
open,
beat.
mouth stretched in a scream
Sarah.
frozen in time.
He didn't know whether to
There was
hope
no
or
sign
fear.
of the girl,
He
no
couldn't
trace of
stand
the
the thought of
shadows,
losing her,
only the
but the
faint
terror
sound
that
of
had gripped
crying in
him
the
for so
wind.
long now made him question everything. Was she still alive? Or had the figure already claimed her as its own? The figure turned its head, its dark eyes never leaving Mark's as it took another step forward. It was then that Mark realized it wasn't just after Sarah. It was after everyone who had ever stepped foot in this cursed place. "You should have left when you had the chance," the figure whispered again, its voice a dark lullaby. "Now, you will join the others. Forever." Mark felt a cold, icy grip around his heart. The figure moved closer, its presence suffocating him. He could feel its cold breath on his skin, its fingers reaching for him. Panic surged through him, and he bolted to his feet, rushing toward the door. But as he reached for the handle, the room seemed to close in on him, the walls narrowing, the space shrinking. The door slammed shut before his hands could even touch the knob. He turned, his breath coming in frantic gasps. The figure was standing in front of him now, blocking his way. "Leaving is not an option," it said, its voice now a low growl. "You belong to this place, just like Sarah, just like everyone before you." Mark backed away, his mind racing, his heart pounding in his chest. He had to escape. He had to find a way out. But the figure wasn't done yet. With a swift, terrifying motion, it reached out and grabbed him by the arm, its fingers like ice, its grip unyielding. Mark cried out in pain, but the figure didn't release him. Instead, it pulled him toward the fireplace, where the flames flickered weakly, casting long, grotesque shadows on the walls. "You'll never leave," the figure whispered, its voice now a harsh, mocking tone. "You will stay here, trapped in this endless night." Mark struggled, trying to break free, but it was no use. The figure was too strong, its grip like iron. And as it dragged him toward the hearth, Mark knew, with a cold certainty, that he was never going to escape. He would never see the light of day again. The house had claimed him, just like it had claimed so many others before him. And now, trapped in the endless dark, he would become just another lost soul, wandering the halls of the cursed cabin, forever trapped in its grip. Sarah was gone. He was gone. And the cabin remained, forever waiting, forever hungry, its doors forever closed to the outside world. And so, the legend of the cabin in the mountains grew, spreading from one generation to the next, a warning to anyone who might be foolish enough to venture too close to its dark embrace. Some say they still hear the whispers on the wind, the sound of footsteps in the snow, the faintest traces of a long-forgotten nightmare. No one knows for sure. But one thing is certain: the cabin never forgets.